38. The flight deck of a Comet. For several of the Comet's avionics systems were new to civil aviation. One such feature was irreversible, powered flight controls, which increased the pilot's ease of control and the safety of the aircraft by preventing aerodynamic forces from changing the directed positions and placement of the aircraft's control surfaces. 39. Many of the control surfaces, such as the elevators, were equipped with a complex gearing system as a safeguard against accidentally stressing the surfaces or airframe at higher speed ranges. 40. The Comet had a total of 4 hydraulic systems, 2 primaries, 1 secondary, and a final emergency system for basic functions such as lowering the undercarriage. 41. The undercarriage could also be lowered by a combination of gravity and a hand pump. 42. Power was siphoned from all 4 engines for the hydraulics, cabin air conditioning, and the de-icing system. These systems had operational redundancy in that they could keep working even if only a single engine was active. 17. The majority of hydraulic components were centered in a single avionics bay. 43. A pressurized refueling system, developed by Flight Refueling Limited, allowed the Comet's fuel tanks to be refueled at a far greater rate than by other methods. 44. The Comet 4 Navigator's Station. The cockpit was significantly altered for the Comet 4's introduction, on which an improved layout focusing on the onboard navigational suite was introduced. 45. An ECHO E-160 radar unit was installed in the Comet 4's nose cone, providing search functions as well as ground and cloud mapping capabilities. 38. And a radar interface was built into the Comet 4 cockpit along with 3 designed instruments. 45. Sudist's Design Bureau, while working on the Sud Aviation Caravel in 1953, licensed several design features from de Havilland, building on previous collaborations on earlier licensee designs, including the DH-100 Vampire Winking Sad Smiley N12. The nose and cockpit layout of the Comet 1 was grafted on top Caravel. 47. In 1969, when the Comet 4's design was modified by Hawker Siddeley to become the basis for the Nimrod, the cockpit layout was completely redesigned and bore little resemblance to its predecessors except for the control yoke. 48. Fuselage. Diverse geographic destinations and cabin pressurization alike on the Comet demanded the use of a high proportion of alloys, plastics, and other materials new to civil aviation across the aircraft to meet certification requirements. 49. The Comet's high cabin pressure and fast operating speeds were unprecedented in commercial aviation, making its fuselage design an experimental process. 49. At its introduction, Comet airframes would be subjected to an intense, high-speed operating schedule, which included simultaneous extreme heat from desert airfields and frosty cold from the kerosene-filled fuel tanks still cold from cruising at high altitude. 49. A Comet 1's fuselage and de Havilland Ghost engine intakes. The Comet's thin metal skin was composed of advanced new alloys, N13, and was both riveted and chemically bonded, which saved weight and reduced the risk of fatigue cracks spreading from rivets. 50. The chemical bonding process was accomplished using a new adhesive, Redux, which was liberally used in the construction of the wings and the fuselage of the Comet. It also had the advantage of simplifying the manufacturing process. 51. When several of the fuselage alloys were discovered to be vulnerable to weakening via metal fatigue, a detailed routine inspection process was introduced. As well as thorough visual inspections of the outer skin, mandatory structural sampling was routinely conducted by both civil and military Comet operators. The need to inspect areas not easily viewable by the naked eye led to the introduction of widespread radiography examination in aviation. These also had the advantage of detecting cracks and flaws too small to be seen otherwise. 52. Operationally, the design of the cargo holds led to considerable difficulty for the ground crew, especially baggage handlers at the airports. The cargo hold had its doors located directly underneath the aircraft, so each item of baggage or cargo had to be loaded vertically upwards from the top of the baggage truck, then slid along the hold floor to be stacked inside. The individual pieces of luggage and cargo also had to be retrieved in a similarly slow manner at the arriving airport. 53, 54. Propulsion. The Comet was powered by two pairs of turbojet engines buried in the wings close to the fuselage. Chief designer Bishop chose the Comet's embedded engine configuration because it avoided the drag of podded engines and allowed for a smaller fin and rudder since the hazards of asymmetric thrust were reduced. 55. The engines were outfitted with baffles to reduce noise emissions, and extensive soundproofing was also implemented to improve passenger conditions. 56. The Comet 4's enlarged Rolls-Royce Avon engine intakes placing the engines within the wings had the advantage of reduction in the risk of foreign object damage, which could seriously damage jet engines. The low-mounted engines and good placement of service panels also made aircraft maintenance easier to perform. 57. The Comet's buried engine configuration increased its structural weight and complexity. Armor had to be placed around the engine cells to contain debris from any serious engine failures. Also, placing the engines inside the wing required a more complicated wing structure. 58. The Comet 1 featured 5050 lbf, 22.5 kN, de Havilland Ghost 50 Mk1 turbojet engines. 29, 59. Two hydrogen peroxide-powered de Havilland Sprite booster rockets were originally intended to be installed to boost takeoff under hot and high-altitude conditions from airports such as Khartoum and Nairobi. 31, 60. These were tested on 30 flights, but Ghosts alone were considered powerful enough and some airlines concluded that rocket motors were impractical. 13. Sprite fittings were retained on production aircraft. 61. Comet 1's subsequently received more powerful 5700 lbf, 25 kN, Ghost DGT-3 series engines. 62. From the Comet 2 onwards, the Ghost engines were replaced by the newer and more powerful 7000 lbf, 31 kN, Rolls-Royce Avon H.65 engines. To achieve optimum efficiency with the new power plants, the air intakes were enlarged to increase mass airflow. 63. Upgraded Avon engines were introduced on the Comet 3, 63, and the Avon-powered Comet 4 was highly praised for its takeoff performance from high-altitude locations such as Mexico City, where it was operated by Mexicana de Aviación, a major scheduled passenger air carrier. 64, 65. Operational history. Introduction. The earliest production aircraft, registered GALYP, Job Peter, first flew on the 9th of January, 1951 and was subsequently lent to Borg for development flying by its Comet unit. 66. On the 22nd of January, 1952, the fifth production aircraft, registered GALIS, received the first certificate of airworthiness awarded to a Comet 6 months ahead of schedule. 67. On the 2nd of May, 1952, as part of Borg's route proving trials, GALYP took off on the world's first jetliner, N14, flight with fare-paying passengers and inaugurated scheduled service from London to Johannesburg. 69, 70, 71. The final Comet from Borg's initial order, registered GALYZ, began flying in September 1952 and carried cargo along South American routes while simulating passenger schedules. 72. Borg Comet 1 at Entebbe Airport, Uganda in 1952. Prince Philip returned from the Helsinki Olympic Games with GALIS on the 4th of August 1952. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret were guests on a special flight of the Comet on 30 June 1953 hosted by Sir Geoffrey and Lady de Havilland. 73 flights on the Comet were about 50% faster compared to advanced piston-engined aircraft such as the Douglas DC-6, 490 miles per hour, 790 kilometers per hour, vs 315 miles per hour, 507 kilometers per hour, respectively, and a faster rate of climb further cut flight times. In August 1953 BOA scheduled the 9-stop London to Tokyo flights by Comet for 36 hours, compared to 86 hours and 35 minutes on its Argonaut, a DC-4 variant, piston airliner. Pan Am's DC-6B was scheduled for 46 hours 45 minutes. The 5-stop flight from London to Johannesburg was scheduled for 21 hours 20 min. 74. In their first year, Comets carried 30,000 passengers. As the aircraft could be profitable with a load factor as low as 43%, commercial success was expected. 27. The Ghost engines allowed the Comet to fly above weather that competitors had to fly through. They ran smoothly and were less noisy than piston engines, had low maintenance costs and were fuel efficient above 30,000 feet, 9,100 m. N15. In summer 1953, 8 Borg Comets left London each week, 3 to Johannesburg, 2 to Tokyo, 2 to Singapore and 1 to Colombo. 75. In 1953, the Comet appeared to have achieved success for de Havilland. 76. Popular mechanics wrote that Britain had a lead of 3 to 5 years on the rest of the world in jetliners. 71. As well as the sales to BOAC, 2. French Airlines, Union Aéromaritime de Transport and Air France, each acquired 3 Comet 1 as an upgraded variant with greater fuel capacity, for flights to West Africa and the Middle East. 77. 78. A slightly longer version of the Comet 1 with more powerful engines. The Comet 2 was being developed. 79. And orders were placed by Air India. 80. British Commonwealth Pacific Airlines. 81. Japan Airlines. 82. Linea Aeropostal Venezolana. 82. And Pan Air do Brasil. 82. American Carriers Capital Airlines, National Airlines, and Pan Am placed orders for the planned Comet 3, an even larger, longer-range version for transatlantic operations. 83. 84. Qantas was interested in the Comet 1 but concluded that a version with more range and better takeoff performance was needed for the London to Canberra route. 85. Early hull losses. On the 26th of October, 1952, the Comet suffered its first hull loss when a Borg flight departing Rome SC Umpino Airport failed to become airborne and ran into rough ground at the end of the runway. 2 passengers sustained minor injuries, but the aircraft, GALYZ, was a write-off. On the 3rd of March, 1953, a new Canadian Pacific Airlines Comet 1AM, registered CFCUN and named Empress of Hawaii, failed to become airborne while attempting a night takeoff from Karachi, Pakistan, on a delivery flight to Australia. The aircraft plunged into a dry drainage canal and collided with an embankment, killing all 5 crew and 6 passengers on board. 86. 87. The accident was the first fatal jetliner crash. 82. In response, Canadian Pacific cancelled its remaining order for a second Comet 1AM and never operated the type in commercial service. 82. Both early accidents were originally attributed to pilot error, as over-rotation had led to a loss of lift from the lagging edge of the aircraft's wings. It was later determined that the Comet's wing profile experienced a loss of lift at a high angle of attack, and its engine inlets also suffered a lack of pressure recovery in the same. Borg Comet 1 GALYX, Yoke X-ray, at London Heathrow Airport in 1953 prior to a scheduled flight conditions. As a result, de Havilland reprofiled the wing's leading edge with a pronounced droop, 88, and wing fences were added toe control span-wise flow. 89. A fictionalized investigation into the Comet's takeoff accidents was the subject of the novel Cone of Silence, 1959, by Arthur David Beattie, a former Borg captain. Cone of Silence was made into a film in 1960, and Beattie also counted the story of the Comet's takeoff accidents in a chapter of his non-fiction work, Strange Encounters, Mysteries of the Air. 1984. 90. The Comet's second fatal accident occurred on the 2nd of May, 1953, when BOAC Flight 783, a Comet 1, registered GALYV, crashed in a severe thundersquall 6 minutes after taking off from Calcutta Dum Dum, now Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose International Airport, India, 91. Killing all 43 on board. Witnesses observed the wingless Comet on fire plunging into the village of Jagalgiri, 92, leading investigators to suspect structural failure. 93. India Court of Inquiry. After the loss of GALYV, the Government of India convened a Court of Inquiry, 92, to examine the cause of the accident. N16. Professor Nathan Srinivasan joined the inquiry as the main technical expert. A larger portion of the aircraft was recovered and reassembled at Farnborough, 93, during which the breakup was found to have begun with a left elevator spar failure in the horizontal stabilizer. The inquiry concluded that the aircraft had encountered extreme negative G-forces during takeoff. Severe turbulence generated by adverse weather was determined to have induced downloading, leading to the loss of the wings. Examination of the cockpit controls suggested that the pilot may have inadvertently overstressed the aircraft when pulling out of a steep dive by over-manipulation of the fully powered flight controls. Investigators did not consider metal fatigue as a contributory cause. 94. The inquiry's recommendations revolved around the enforcement of stricter speed limits during turbulence, and two significant design changes also resulted. All Comets were equipped with weather radar and the feel system was introduced, which ensured that control column forces, invariably called stick forces, would be proportional to control loads. This artificial feel was the first of its kind to be introduced in an aircraft. 93. The Comet 1 and 1AM had been criticized for a lack of feel in their controls, 95, and investigators suggested that this might have contributed to the pilot's alleged overstressing of the aircraft. Winking sad smiley, 96. Comet chief test pilot John Cunningham contended that the jetliner flew smoothly and was highly responsive in a manner consistent with other de Havilland aircraft. 97. N17. Comet disasters of 1954. Fuselage fragment of GALYP at the Science Museum in London just over a year later. Rome Ciumpino Airport, the site of the first Comet hull loss, was the origin of a more disastrous Comet flight. On the 10th of January, 1954, 20 minutes after taking off from Ciumpino, the first production Comet, GALYP, broke up in mid-air while operating Borg Flight 781 and crashed into the Mediterranean off the Italian island of Elba with the loss of all 35 on board. 98, 99, with no witnesses to the disaster and only partial radio transmissions as incomplete evidence, no obvious reason for the crash could be deduced. Engineers at de Havilland immediately recommended 60 modifications aimed at any possible design flaw, while the Abel Committee met to determine potential causes of the crash. 100, N18. Borg also voluntarily grounded its Comet fleet pending investigation into the causes of the accident. 102, Abel Committee Court of Inquiry. Media attention centered on potential sabotage winking sad smiley 88. Other speculation ranged from clear air turbulence to an explosion of vapor in an empty fuel tank. The Abel Committee focused on 6 potential aerodynamic and mechanical causes. Control flutter, which had led to the loss of DH-108 prototype.